Now, unfortunately, those of you who are leaving were probably expecting Ivan Sandrea to speak, and I think he's probably in a restaurant on the Champs-Élysées at the moment, admiring the view. So I'm going to give his talk, or our talk. For those of you who don't know Ivan, he's Venezuelan by birth. He has, in fact, his dad came to one of our forums about a year ago and gave one of the most, who's in his mid-70s by the way, most lively presentations I've seen on enhanced oil recovery and future oil production and so on. Ivan's got a history of having worked for OPEC, he worked for BP, he was recruited in Venezuela I think, and then Statoil, and then he ran a company called Energy Intelligence. Actually he and I sort of working together to get an oil company started, and at the moment one of his allegiances is the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, which is what appears on the programme and is his allegiance, actually not mine. We've decided, I suppose, as we've got to know each other over the last 12 months or so, to focus on and talk about onshore exploration in general and in some specific areas for a handful of reasons. First of all, it is actually very unfashionable. I mean, if you look at the literature that you can pick up on the internet is weighted about 5 to 1 in favour of offshore, particularly deep water. So 5 parts deep water, 1 part onshore stuff. And if you looked at Keith's presentation, for example, you'd see that the exploration effort has been like that and the discovery success has been like that. So in Keith's list of, I think, what did you have, 14 or 15 discoveries of more than 100 million barrels last year? There were 2 onshore. And that's reflecting as much as anything a lack of effort, I think. The reason we're interested in is because Ivan in particular, and at his last presentation here, he documented pretty carefully that there are still huge resources to be discovered onshore, we think. So that's a reason for focusing on it. This is a personal view by me, but the second reason is because the cost of drilling in deep water has moved into the zone of being prohibitive. When you're paying $650,000 a day for a bareback rig to drill in deep water, 5th generation rig, that's a lot of money for a 200-day well, or even longer well. So cost of drilling offshore is just continuing to rise. The other thing that's less well observed is that deep water development projects take a long time, run over budget and finish up running late. So for example, I hesitate to say this because I'm on screen and who knows what fingers may be pointing towards me, but when I was still at BP I was involved in acquiring a block in Angola, block 31, which we acquired back before 2000, I think. First discovery drilled in 2002, first oil produced 2012, 10 years discovery to first oil. That's a long time in an economic calculation. It was a year and a half to 2 years late and ran $4 billion over budget. These are not unusual numbers. If you read, for example, Bernstein's reports on the deep water industry, these are normal sort of things to happen. So project overruns in cost and time and long delays between actually cash flow back to the spender of the exploration capex. So that seems to me, those 3 things taken together, there is oil, particularly oil to be discovered, costs are escalating and deep water projects are very, very difficult. Seem to be reasons to me why, or to others I should say, why small and medium-sized companies should be thinking more about onshore, where costs can be lower, not definitely lower, but can be lower. You can do projects with a different time scale of execution and so on. Now, despite the publicity. This is not simply a story about a global search for shale oil and shale gas. It is partly, but only partly. These are numbers that you see on here, the 20 trillion BOE remaining to be delivered from the few basins that have shale oil and gas production, i.e. the green ones, and the many still to be explored for shale oil and gas, the red ones. 20 trillion BOE, those are Kimmeridge Energy's estimates, and you will have seen them a couple of times here. So interesting, and you can, at the end of this talk, one of the things that we will pick out is that, for example, we would see the Bazhenov, for example, as a key shale oil that's going to be explored by Exxon and Rosneft in the next 12 to 18 months. Nor is this about, and Chris Wheaton, who's now left for the day, asked the question about, you know, as an investor, trying to understand how explorers actually work and, more importantly, think. And he asked the question of Keith, I think. One of the, perhaps particularly with smaller companies, I think, one of the commonest causes of problems, indeed failures, sometimes known as dry holes, is that a particular geological hobby or hobby horse of somebody is pursued. And this talk is not about that either. I mean, there are obviously lots of geological themes that could work in the world, in lots of different countries. And I'll just stop and say, to me, the sort of effort that was talked about, the sort of outcome that was talked about by GTEC and NEFTEC's first thing of figuring out where the right basins are and where to be in those basins are the sine qua non of successful explorers. If you're not driven by regional thinking, geological thinking, profound thinking, then you're going to get absolutely nowhere. And a lot of AIM-sized companies commit that sin before they even shoot a line of seismic or drill a well. And Chris was asking about the process that explorers go through. I mean, talking about onshore, you have to accept the fact that most of the basins we're talking about have been walked over, had donkeys ridden over them, Land Rovers driven over them for the last 150 years. So you have to be finding a new way of stating something, perceiving something, seeing something. And just saying I'm more intelligent than the last guy doesn't really hack it. So in terms of the processes involved, and some of my ex-BP colleagues will smile at this lot and think I've simply probably stolen the ideas, and that's partly true. But it does seem to me to talk about new things. You have to be talking about one of these three things. You have to be talking about new geography, i.e. there is a political change or some sort of change that has opened the country up. This was profoundly evident in the early 90s when countries such as Venezuela, Angola, Nigeria, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan and so on changed their approach to inward investment from Western oil companies. At the moment you can see that same process happening in, for example, Myanmar, potentially in Mexico, though perhaps more slowly than people would like. Lebanon. Neil Hodgson, who was meant to be here today, a couple of forums ago pointed out the profound political change that's happened in Lebanon, which has opened up their offshore, and the changes of sort of three political groups in Lebanon who, let's say, don't like one another very much, have at least found a way to work together on energy topics, on licensing in particular. So actually a very profound change. Clearly there's been a big change in Libya. The country is in principle much more open to Western involvement than it was. I mean, clearly this week, for example, BP has just withdrawn a lot of staff from Libya, non-essential staff, and there's a long way to go before the country settles down. But those 3 or 4 are examples of political change, change in the political dimension of various sorts, which leads you into new geography. And we'll come back to talk about 1 or 2 of those. New technologies. Probably in the 90s, the new technologies that opened up the industry were the ability to drill in water deeper than that found in the North Sea or west of Shetland, so out beyond a few hundred metres. And now, as we can see, out to a couple of thousand metres. And the availability of regional 3D exploration seismic offshore. I mean, those 2 things, technologies, transformed the industry in the first half of the 90s. Now you would talk about fracking, you can talk about gravity gradiometry. Those of you who were here last time when we had a session on East Africa will have seen that Tullow, where I'm on the board, nothing to do with me because I'm a non-executive director and nobody takes any notice of what non-execs say, but Tullow has shot 60,000 square kilometres of FTG, gravity gradiometry, in Kenya, and that's what we're exploring with, compared with 5,000 or 6,000 in Uganda a couple of years ago. You can see the world of requiring 1,000 people to run a 3D seismic survey. You know, poor guys mainly, I'm not being sexist here, but strong men from local villages carrying huge cables around in 40 degrees and wading in mangrove swamps. Maybe a thing of the past because we're heading towards a world of wireless seismic. So new technology is coming. And then the other obvious thing, which brings in the geological element, of course, is when you see an idea that works. Again, not talking about Tullow in particular, but if you look at the source reservoir combinations that Tullow has been exploring in Ghana, then the sort of work that, for example, Nevtex is doing is lead you around the planet and say where might something similar of the same age actually occur in West Greenland, North Atlantic, Southeast Asia. So quite a profound use of analogues in that sense, depth of meaning to the word analogues. So the argument Ivan and I have is if you're not able to talk about one of these, about your new idea under one of these headings, or more than one preferably, then best not to talk about it. Put your own money into it rather than somebody else's. Okay, we have about a dozen countries we want to, or areas we want to talk about, and I'm not going to go into them in detail. The geology is this and so on. What I'm going to try and do is justify for each one how we've arrived at a categorization like this. So in each of the cases, you'll actually see up in the upper right-hand corner what our American colleagues tend to call a doohickey, which is just a summary of what the elements in this are. Myanmar is probably the most obvious of the new geography that will then be impacted by new technology examples. I mean, the country has been all but closed to Western or any oil companies of note for, 50 years. The offshore is subject of great interest at the moment from lots of companies. We are focused on the onshore. This is the talk about onshore hotspots. Onshore in Myanmar, you do have production that dates from before the Second World War, the 20s and 30s. It is a prime candidate for the use of new technologies such as gravity gradiometry, faster seismic, wireless seismic in particular, and so on. So, and the play types that you can imagine cover, I mean, if you're talking about analogues, you can introduce almost any analog you care to look for. Strike slip, fold belts, fallen basins, you name it, you can find it onshore in this area. So our feeling is, you know, Myanmar is a classic example of something that's being exposed to Western oil companies, Western technology, and Western geological thinking for the first time. And this is going to be very active over the next 12 or 18 months. Sort of different example, and this is really, you know, why I said at the beginning we can talk about, say, Southeast Asia a little bit, because there are places in Southeast Asia that have not seen the full benefit of modern geoscience thinking and modern technology. India is one of them. India onshore, in particular, a huge number of basins in the onshore and very shallow offshore. All sorts of geologies sitting in there, all sort of analogues you could appeal to. Main success onshore has been up here, of course, where Cairn was successful in the rift system, with all sorts of analogues. Not new geography, the country's been explored since 100 years ago, but new technologies, change will happen as a result of a slow-moving bureaucracy becoming slightly less slow-moving. I was going to say quick. I think that's probably an exaggeration. But again, a country where you can say new technologies will impact the ability to explore, reconnaissance, big areas quickly with things like gravity and fast seismic based on wireless and so on. So interesting, and staying in Southeast Asia, just to talk about China. One of the things that weeks do not pass without hearing about somebody having done a deal in China for their unconventional potential. Lots of basins, the Tarim through to the Sandrea, all sorts of ages, rocks and so on. And looking at Southeast Asia as a whole, then somewhere like the Cooper Basin with its Permian shales and the Canning, and then in India, for example, the Cambay. So, and these countries also figuring in coal bed methane rankings in the top dozen. So that's talking about China, Indonesia, and Australia. I think this actually is an area where you will hear a lot and not very much will happen. As soon as you get close to looking at one of the Chinese unconventional plays, you begin to bump into, well, actually the source rock is not quite as good as we thought. So there will be a lot of noise. China is obviously a place to be. A lot of talk about bringing North American, US successful technologies, particularly fracking, into China, and not very much in the way of discoveries. But again, qualifiers on new technology and analogues. Moving along, we wanted to talk about Africa in general, and really this is a silly thing to do because it's impossible to classify a whole continent in one picture. What we just wanted to highlight is that there are things beginning to go on in the interior of Africa rather than just along the rift, which is obviously in the interior, and offshore in various places. I mean, so we have the onshore SAG basins being targeted. People are beginning, I mean, the lack of data in this sort of area of Chad, Central African Republic, Sudan and so on is quite stark, but people are beginning to think about those basins. Earlier in the year we heard about, fairly briefly, about the possibilities of the Karoo and other areas in South Africa. Shell is interested in taking large amounts of acreage there. Again, our sense is that this is going to be talked about a lot, but little is actually going to happen in the way of discoveries. People are going to be nervous about going into this area. People are going to be nervous for commercial reasons about chasing hydrocarbons in the middle of Africa. Again, if you listen and look to what Shell is saying, their plans seem to be probably beyond 2020 we'll be doing something here. So again, you'll hear about these as potential, but the real centre of activity is going to be continue to be East Africa and people chasing oil. And we'll come back to that in a second. Just to talk about Libya. Again, you'll have heard a presentation here, but just to remind you of the numbers. When you add up new exploration, enhanced oil recovery of existing fields, most Libyan fields have recovery factors of known reserves of way less than 30%. And the potential for shale oil and shale gas in the rich source rocks, particularly as you come into this part. You're talking 60 billion barrels oil equivalent resources remaining potential. So these are big numbers. And the thing that's awaited here is the security situation. So it's probably wrong to call it new geography. This is old geography revisited. New technologies, yes, because the area has been, the country has been closed to true Western oil and gas companies for a long while. And lots of analogues, new geoscience thinking to be imported. The one thing you could say is there is a dearth of modern geoscience thinking in what's been done in the Libyan industry. Moving on to East Africa. At our last forum, we had 3 presentations from Sasol, Aminex and Tullow Oil. And if you took each of them and put them together, you could work out where you need to go to explore for oil in East Africa. This slide here is actually a slide from Sasol, which summarises rather neatly what has been done so far. So you know about Uganda. There are prospects in the DRC. There's some oil production in Sudan. Beginnings of oil exploration in Ethiopia, beginnings in Kenya, gas discoveries en masse, as Keith pointed out earlier here. And at the south end of this particular picture, you have Sasol's in the Sahara oil field, which actually the speaker, almost as a joke, said the last oil field in the African Rift System, or the furthest south oil field in the African Rift System. And in truth, he was probably saying something quite accurate. And where we finished up was, if you look at the next picture, what you could say is it's clearly correct to do what Tullow and its partners have done, which is to start chasing the Rift System oil out of Uganda into Kenya and into Ethiopia. So we have, I'm using the word in the Tullow sense now, 2 or 3 wells here, and we have one that will be completed in Ethiopia within the next couple of months, I hope. There is a logic to pursuing the Rift play to the south. The difficulty is mainly logistical here, that the access to the rifts is more difficult. Lake Tanganyika is 2,000 metres, I think, deep in the middle, so the development concepts are a bit tricky. But there's no doubt that following the oil south is a good idea. But the other very persuasive argument that Mike Rigo from Aminex made and I think it rings true, is that rather than doing what some companies are focused on at the moment, which is looking for oil along this margin of the basins that's sitting here, you ought to be looking at the coastal strip, which means just onshore, the transition zone, and the very shallow offshore. And what that tells you is that, again, this area should or needs to yield to new technology. As I said earlier, until they were following let's pursue gravity gradiometry model of the world into Kenya and Ethiopia, 50,000-60,000 square kilometre surveys. There's absolutely no, and that mixture of those surveys plus some 2D is a very good way of exploring tertiary rift systems. No reason why you shouldn't pursue that philosophy here. And then out here, there is a new technology needed, a new seismic acquisition technology needed that will deal with truly exploring in the sort of just onshore, just offshore environment that you found here, and producing coherent exploration geoscience. Again, this is a world of analogues too, analogues in the rift system, and so on. So East Africa oil we would highlight as one of the things that you should look at and expect results, things to happen in the next 12, 18 months. Probably in the case of Kenya, six months. One of Ivan's favourite places, which he gets very enthusiastic about, but then comes to his senses, is Mexico. Again, potentially classic new geography. The country is changing. New license terms for onshore, new encouragement of companies, actually particularly in unconventionals, to take exploration licenses. The deep water is proving much more difficult, much more politically contentious, much more difficult probably for Mexico to see itself as part of a system which stops at the US-Mexico median line here on border. So I think when we first wrote this talk, Mexico was going to be one of the "this will happen soon" slides. Realistically, our view, and I met with BP's president of BP Mexico a couple of weeks ago, and realistically this is going to be something that unfolds over the next year, 18 months, 2 years. But one day this country will be open, and the potential will be enormous. Again, Ivan particularly likes Peru. Again, this is based almost entirely on analogues. As you know, the Colombia foreland in particular has been successful. Rubiales, for example, have been very, very successful in the Colombia foreland. So the notion here is quite simple. With the ability to shoot seismic that we now have, particularly 3D seismic, the successes of Colombia will just progress further southwards. I remember, it must be a couple of years ago, hearing that Petro Rubiales had an astonishing onshore success rate based on using 3D in the Colombia foreland. So, place that really can work, and lots of analogues of what's going on, and basically happening now. Companies becoming active and shooting seismic and drilling. We talked about Brazil a little bit as well, but Brazil onshore. Here we're looking at the world of very old basins. Again, you can hardly call Brazil new geography. The country has been open, at least on its own terms, for a long, long time. But moving onshore, And, you know, I've met with the representatives of a couple of Brazilian, very Brazilian companies that are active onshore in Brazil, driven by satellite sensing, gravity and magnetics, sparse seismic, etc. One of them, Petroenergia, for example, is very focused on the San Francisco basin here. You can see some huge gas resource estimates, 208 TCF. That actually excludes the San Francisco basin. So huge onshore gas potential in onshore Brazil, in very old rocks. So you're talking about tight gas and also shale gas. The numbers in the San Francisco basin are very large, as I recall, about 100 TCF. And this one really is a watch this space. There will be very great activity over the next 18 months. 2 or 3 others, and then we'll finish up. We were planning to say something about this country. And of course you can go down the fracking and analog and shale gas and potentially shale oil in northwest England and be enthusiastic, or you can face reality and say, I hesitate to say not in my lifetime, because this probably means that crossing over to Fortnum and Masons I'll get run over this afternoon. But this is moving so slowly and there's so much difficulty, and actually, despite what you read in the newspapers, so little political support from DEC, that this isn't going to change, I would say, until UKIP wins the election, which might be in the next century for all I know. So this is a passing right along, moving right along, I think. Two others. Keith talked about Kurdistan, and he's absolutely right. Kurdistan is a great focus activity. This slide is actually from, Ivan and I had a big argument about whether it was new geography or whether we should have a category of new geography revisited or something, because clearly BP and sorry, was that a song being played for me or something? BP in its guise of probably Darcy exploration, but certainly Anglo-Persian, was exploring here in the 1920s, and Kirkuk, you know, was discovered by BP and its partners without the use of seismic data in I guess the 1930s. You think 30s? So hugely active, huge oil field, 25 billion, etc., etc. Lots of activity, and some people who have been in the newspapers, and I should get Gary to switch off the video here, are simply drilling wells that were drilled 50 years ago or 100 years ago and re-drilling them and saying, look, we have a discovery. Talisman, who provided us with this picture, I believe, are not doing that. This is new exploration and a significant discovery by them. This will be a very noisy activity over the next 18 months. Politically quite noisy because the country of Iraq and the folks in Kurdistan have to decide what they do about oil export and explorers and whether it's possible to work in both halves of the country and so on. But there's no doubt this is a tremendous oil province with terrific possibilities, and basically yielding to new technology, particularly new seismic technology, where you can shoot 2Ds and 3Ds with a quality that you couldn't aspire to when Western companies last explored here in, I guess, in the 70s. There is still, as far as I understand it, absolutely no way of predicting whether you're going to find oil and gas in the reservoir you're about to drill into, but nonetheless terrific potential. And just finally, one more country to visit here, just to talk about Russia. Again, lots of ways you could talk about Russia onshore. Just to focus on the unconventional picture, and in particular, all four of these countries have large shale oil and shale gas potential. Shell, for example, just signed just back in February, I guess it was, a big deal with the Ukraine for multi-billion-dollar gas deal. The big item here is Exxon and Rosneft exploring the Bazhenov shale, which they're going to start, I believe, this year. And certainly next year they'll be quite active. So, sorry that was a bit of a tour round. That I guess the essential point here is, it's in a way to address the question Chris Wheaton asked about process. If you tour around the likely oil and gas provinces of the onshore world, you can very easily arrive at a list of 50 or 60 with tremendous potential. And the absolute key is to have some ability to say, well, we as a company or I as an individual believe these are the top 5 or 10 that we should be pursuing. And the answer to Chris's question about exploration process was, the key point is to have a big long list and only do the top bit. That's what seems to work. And if you're an exploration company driven by a geologist who says, I believe in the Paleocene of the North Sea, probably best to go and invest your money elsewhere. Therefore, on that basis, we said what we ought to do is say, out of this long list, what are the 4 that we really like? 4 or 5, and there they are. We think pretty well no-brainer is that Myanmar will be exceedingly popular, not only offshore but onshore, and that enthusiasm will probably extend into the adjacent countries as well, Vietnam, Laos and so on. In the unconventional world, we would say 2 things to watch for. One, repeat myself, Exxon and Rosneft with a free ride for BP, of course, exploring the Bazhenov. Petroenergia beginning to attack the San Francisco basin, onshore Brazil. I thought it was Caribbean, and it was objecting to the Caribbean not being mentioned. Onshore in Africa, I think the interesting question is, can you find oil? Again, as Keith said, you have to say that finding incremental, even large volumes of gas in East Africa particular, but actually almost anywhere, are a sort of value-destroying activity. And somebody is going to start working on the landlocked basins of Central Africa, and beginning to deal with the fact that though they're data poor, maybe they have potential. And finally, if you listen to, again, the first presentation, the most exciting company of the last 12 or 18 months has probably been cobalt. It pains me to say it because, of course, the answer should be Tullow, but let's say it's Cobalt International, and the question is what they've done, particularly in Angola, is the subsalt, and the question about Angola is, can we chase the subsalt onshore, and who's going to be brave enough to do that? And maybe you will start hearing about that in the next 12, 18 months. With that, I'll stop for questions, and then I'll do the most important thing, which is draw the sweepstake for the Kindle Fire, and let you all. We do have tea and coffee organised outside. Apologies if there was a shortage of sandwiches, because normally when we have lunch at the end, we lose 20% of the audience for sandwiches, and we have just enough, whereas today we had just not enough. But anybody got any questions? If not, I will do my duty. Yeah, please, Keith. Yeah.
One comment about the Bazanov, because there's a lot of talk about the Bazanov shale, and clearly the potential is huge. However, you know, the experience and the cost profile of tight oil in the States suggests the one big barrier I see, and I'm just interested in your comments, is there's the cost of tight oil from the Bazanov is going to be so much higher. The rent, in other words, from developing the Bazanov shale is going to be so much less than conventional Russian oil. And Russia lives off, it's a state that lives off its rent.
Yeah.
Is that going to be a big barrier? I mean, what's the incentive for the Russian state to really go hell for leather for it? Because there's not much rent in it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're, I mean, two things, Keith. I mean, first of all, if you look at successful oil plays, even the really, you know, and there's a lot of sort of news at the moment saying, well, actually, there are only really 3 or 4 great oil shales in the US, and the rest of them are becoming increasingly marginal. Even in the great oil shales like the Eagle Ford, it's very clear that there's a core area, real sweet spot, and if you're in the sweet spot, you make money, and it's not that you don't care what the oil price is, but your oil price floor is much lower. Yeah. So anywhere you go, even if the politics were perfect, you would have that. And I would say, you know, when you talk to somebody in the US about a basin or a salt rock and say, how many wells have you got going through this thing or relevant to this thing, their usual answer is 10,000 or 12,000 or some such number. When you start exploring globally, the answer to that question is a hell of a lot less. So much more difficult to find the sweet spot, much more thought needed. You know, I think it's interesting because Exxon and Rosneft are testing this. I don't think it's a given that suddenly you'll get lots of Bazanov shale oil. I think they're testing it, assuming it'll work and so on. But you're quite right. The Russian state may turn around and say, what the hell? Why do we need this? You know, let's just put our money into EOR and so on. So I think it's an experiment going on rather than a, yeah. Okay, let me draw this. I do have one more thing to say. But, so who has number 231? Huh? Ah! I was going to say, remember you can buy all the shoes you ever want. Thanks very much. Thank you. I just wanted to put in a plug for our next forum, which is on June the 4th in the morning, here as always. And I did mention when I opened my onshore talk that one of the things that the investment world is waking up to is that deep water development projects using FPSOs are not easy to do. And the general mood, you know, again, for reasons we don't need to go into, I spend a lot of time talking to investors in Tullow and other oil and gas companies. They're very nervous about exploration, as Keith said earlier. And one of the reasons they're nervous is because they see that development projects hit the buffers too often. You know, they produce oil too long after discovery, they overrun, and they cost far too much, and overrun on cost. We have a forum coming up on, so the reality is that the world out there in the city, 2 or 3 miles away, is thinking, when it comes to engineering, these guys don't know what they're doing, particularly small to medium-sized companies. So we decided that our next forum on June the 4th will be about how do you approach developing deep water fields using floating production systems. It sounds a bit esoteric and specialist, but unless you know the answer to that, don't go and ask guys like Chris Wheaton for any money. It's not worth it. So welcome to that future event. Please register for it in the normal way, and we'll see you there.